platforms with some practical insights from the University of Stavanger. And we proceed with Michael from Clicks and Links with a service layer. To make data not just available but usable. And then we would also have a very nice presentation from the Eindhoven municipality, which I already had the chance to look inside. And finally, we have a discussion of around 1 hour. So let's see, I think this is actually the most interesting part of all of this. Okay, so looking into the ICT reference architecture. As you can see, we are going to have a brief introduction on the goals of such an ICT reference architecture. What I think is also very important that people can more or less understand what is the sense behind such a reference model. Why do we need it? And what are other examples which are already very successful out there and that have benefited a lot from such an ICT, from such a reference architecture. So the term ICT, we can just drop it at that point. Then we are going to have a look at the different aspects and views on the ICT reference architecture and also see how different parts of it can interplay. And then we are going to make it very practical. We are going to have a look at what we found out in the lighthouse cities and also in the follower cities and how the ICT reference architecture can help explain the different ICT solutions which we basically somehow like captured within the involved cities. Okay, so you can have a look at what is on the slides, but I think that there is in general a very nice way to approach the idea of a reference architecture, and if you have a look around, so basically the most basic environment that we somehow almost live in with respect to ICT nowadays is the internet. So we get in touch with the internet almost every day in different ways. And the internet and also the telecom world, they are so successful and they have managed to prevail over the years and to establish themselves as what they are right now, exactly because they had such a reference architecture underneath as the basic ingredient for starting this, let's call it, digital revolution. So what the idea was there was to have an abstract explanation of the different type of communication protocols which were available at the current point in time. And basically, probably most of you or the guys, those of you who have some telecom or ICT or IT background, they have heard of the so-called ISO-OSI layered model or TCP/IP layered model. So these are basically the reference architectures for the internet in the telecom world. So these are like abstract models that explain the different interactions between different networks and different parties across the world with respect to communication. So coming from this example, if we have a look at the points which are on that slide, we can see that the main goal of such a reference architecture for smart city is basically to provide a unified view and understanding on the ICT strategies of the involved cities. So this means that people across different cities, the IT people across different cities, should be able to easily understand each other just by referring to a particular reference architecture which we have worked out in the course of the Triangulum project. It means that if person A from city X talks to person B from city Y, then they can already understand each other very easily just by referring to the different artifacts of such an ICT reference architecture. But what is also very strong is that if you go technical and you start looking at the bits and bytes, you also can find different points of conformance or interoperability between different ICT solutions just by thinking and discussing along the structures of an ICT reference architecture. This is where we come to the second point. One of the main goals of the ICT reference architecture for smart cities is to identify interfaces for communication between the involved components. So it means that if you think of such an abstract reference model, you have different, let's call them modules, and they somehow interact with each other. And if you manage to more or less have some well-defined interfaces for the interaction, then it's actually quite possible that you can exchange these modules, that you can take different solutions and somehow plug them together and come up with new solutions for different problems within a city. And this is also possible because you have managed to identify some suitable interfaces among the artifacts of such an ICT reference architecture. And last but not least, we should try, of course, to accommodate the legacy systems which are already out there. So it means such an ICT reference architecture, this is not a revolutionary approach, but it's more of an evolutionary approach. So it means what is out there should somehow be mapped to such an ICT reference architecture, and it should already somehow show the basic functionality within a city, but it should be also possible to add new components on top of these legacy systems according to particular rules of such an ICT reference architecture, as we are about to see in the next slides. Furthermore, we have, for example, the aspect of exchange and interoperability. This is, for example, what I've been just talking about on the previous slide, also standardized interfaces. What is also somehow important is that we wanted to move strongly the direction of open source. Why? Because what you can observe nowadays in many cities is that there is a sort of vendor lock. So there is a particular vendor that comes and they probably start installing different components across the city. So they start really like from the networks, and then they also put in place some platforms, and then they even develop apps for the end users or for the citizens of a city, but there are no clear interfaces, and there is not really a possibility for the technical people to look inside the software and the components which are rolled out. So it means that then the city itself becomes pretty much dependent on this particular vendor. So for that case, we wanted more or less to push the introduction of open source, of open interfaces and open standardized interfaces, and we also wanted to go to make a strong push for open data. So we see basically the core platform, the core data platform, which is going to be the centralized point where data is flowing together within a city, should be based on open data principles. Okay, so I previously already talked about the successful internet and telecom reference models, which are the TCP/IP and TSO-OSI layered model. And so you can basically see both of them on the right side of the slide. And you see that they're already very abstract. So if you have a look at them, you see that there is something quite called a physical layer, a data link layer, a network layer, but there is no particular technology which is mentioned there. So you can see on the right side that there are already some protocols, but they're mostly given just as examples. So it means that you can basically, across such a reference model, you can explain different communication situations or different type of systems in that case. And what is very what is a very nice effect of all this is that you can enable the reuse of components and solutions even across cities. This is what would be really the benefit of this. So you can basically come up with a totally new solution by just combining what is already available in one city with other solutions which are available within the ecosystem of another city. And then you can basically create a new ICT solution for a third city which is somehow involved. What was the last goal of our activities within Triangulum is more or less to push for any sort of standardization, and we already have 2 different activities running there. So one of them is the participation and contribution to the so-called Memorandum of Understanding initiative of the European Commission, where the European Commission has recognized the need for such a reference model for smart cities, for the ICT solutions in smart cities, and is working on such a standard, and we have presented a couple of times our ideas there. And we also have a German initiative within the DIN standardization consortium, where we also contribute with different aspects of the ICT reference architecture, which is developed within Triangulum. Okay, so these are like more or less the different views on the ICT reference architecture as we see it right now. So if we start from the bottom, we have different technical aspects, which means if you think of such a smart city, it is mostly centered around the concept of data. So you basically, within a smart city, your key asset is basically the data, the bits and bytes that you can gather from somewhere, different measurements or different inputs, and you need some infrastructure in order to make this data available in a particular manner such that it can be further reused. So basically you start with some data sources. You have some data network that denoted as communication layer that you use to aggregate these data sources somewhere. And then you can also implement some algorithms on top of this and have some aspects of data processing and analysis. And once you manage to merge and aggregate your data sources, we are not talking about data anymore, but we already talk about information. And in that sense, out of this data, you can come up with different semantic understandings of the data you had. So basically, you're already moving on the level of information. So you have already a business context that you can somehow use your data within. And of course, you can develop different applications and services on top of it. So it means like different services for the citizens, different mobile apps, mobility services. Sorry, okay, just a second. Do you see my slides again? I guess so, yeah, okay. So you have like different mobility services, energy applications, or services based on data from the energy domain, etc. And of course, you have also an organizational view on top of all this. So it means that this is the view where aspects like business objectives, business procedures, but also like regulatory policies and governance play a very significant role. Our focus as IT guys within Triangulum is mainly set on the technical view and on the informational view, of course. But since we are mostly like from Fraunhofer focus, we are mostly like the IT guys. So that's why you see on this picture right now that the technical view is more elaborated in that sense. So how can we imagine all this? So you see on the bottom that we have your data sources. And the data sources, they can be of various types. So you can have sensor networks, you can have social media, you can have smart meters. You can also have something like governmental data. For example, like most of the open data would fall within this area. And then you have some sort of a pre-processing. And afterwards, all this data needs to be somehow communicated to a centralized place. Let's put it like this. And this happens over the so-called communication layer, where you have different types of protocols, which are here. Some of them are given as an example here, but the point is not that you have the specific protocols, but that you have this communication layer itself, and you have some sort of like an interface to this communication layer. Basically also the internet or any sort of global communication network would fall within the communication layer. And once you have your data sources and data is moving over the communication layer, it arrives within the layer of data processing and analysis. What you have there is different types of physical and virtual repositories, which are somehow mostly large databases storing different types of data like sensor data, raw data, and enriched data. And of course, you have some services or some software on top of it for data processing and data analytics. Once this data is somehow made available, you have your applications and services running on top of it. And this is where, for example, different companies or startups or whoever finds this data interesting, which is offered through the data processing and analysis layer, can basically pick up the data and start creating new applications and services like mobile apps, like whatever type of ideas you might have to utilize the data within a city. Afterwards, of course, you have a market layer, which is very well explained by something like a marketplace, like the Google Store, where you can buy an app, or you can somehow find a particular service that you are interested, that you have some interest in. On top of it, you see the user layer, where the users are already interacting with a particular ICT solution. What is now very interesting is that within Triangulum, besides defining some high-level components here and layers, we already put some thought on so-called SIPs. So SIPs are actually so-called service access points. So this is the interface between a particular layer and the layer above. Hence, the SIPs are actually a generic type of interface with specific characteristics, and this generic type of interface already gives some sort of an idea of how interoperability and how the communication between the different layers might look like. So if you have a look in our documents, you would see that we have put quite some effort to define each of these interfaces in a very abstract way. So this means that we have an abstract description of what is happening between the data sources layer and the communication layer, and how does it arrive on the other side within the data processing and analysis layer. And then the next step is basically that you find suitable standards and map them to these SIPs, and this is how you basically create an ecosystem of abstract artifacts and layers and corresponding service access points, which would enable you more or less later on to create or somehow explain ICT solutions within a city. But I think that on the next slides we have some more information exactly on this aspect of the SIPs. What is also very important is the two columns. So on the left side and on the right side, you see those yellow columns, which are somehow very often underestimated when people talk about ICT solutions within a smart city. So these are the aspects of management and security. So since things become much more dependent from data and internet communication and from different digital aspects, the security becomes very crucial in that case. So you can easily, so for the bad guys, from some sort of hackers, it is nowadays very easy to harm some critical infrastructure in case it is not protected appropriately. Hence, security should include at least the bubbles that you see on the right side, like authentication, authorization, key exchange, ID management, privacy, and different sorts of device-to-device authentication, which also means that communication should be encrypted between different devices, but also the communication over the internet should be appropriately secured. Also, the aspect of management is very important, which means on one side the monitoring, but on the other side also the configuration, the network monitoring, as well as data management plans, and different reporting aspects. So you see that this is already like a high-level view on the technical aspect of the ICT reference architecture, but it already becomes very detailed and technical. Okay, if we move on to the, sorry, yeah. I just saw that there is one question, so I just want to read it. 2 questions already, okay. Sorry, just a second. I'm now reading the questions which were posted. So the first question is this slide developed in deliverable .1 document? Just give me a second to understand the question. 6.1. No, what is the number? Our deliverable is 6.1, yeah? Just give me a second. Exactly, so our deliverable is the 6.1, and this is where you would find quite a lot of explanations on this slide. Wait, okay. Okay, so the answer is yes, and I hope that you have the current version, because the first version did not contain the service access points. Now the latest version already has the service access points, and there you can already see our first draft of the interfaces between the layers. Okay, now I just want to check on the second question. Won't it be interesting to move the data storage section to the bottom? Otherwise, cities might have to develop big data centers in the future when they have to provide all the storage space. Yeah, I get your point. However, I think that this data part, the storage section itself, there are different ways to approach this. So, for example, currently, if you look at the open data portals, which are deployed across different cities in Europe, so basically these data portals, they don't really store the data itself, but they're mostly a sort of like a metadata portal that links to particular data sources. And the data sources itself are pretty distributed. So it means that you have you don't have a big data center somewhere, but you mostly have a centralized place from where data is referred to. So for example, like in Germany, we have this gov.data.de portal, and then you can see that if you go on this portal, it's not storing the data itself, but it would forward you to the web pages of different institutions across Germany where you can find the data itself. However, over time, we found that this solution is good, but it's not complete. Hence, there will be also some need for data to be stored somewhere centrally, in particular cases, not for all the data you have. And this data might also be provided, in some cases, as closed data, or you might even need to pay for this data on the fly, depending on the particular situation. So to make it short, I don't think that cities will have to develop big data centers in the future, but they would rather need to integrate some of their data offers, let's put it like this, within larger portals. And this is currently exactly what is the case in Berlin, where the different like institutions, like for example for the health institution of Berlin or whatever, so they don't really, they were not actually forced to develop a larger data center or whatever, but they were basically invited to provide a description of their data to another portal, which links to the data on their web page that is published in general. So this is nothing new for them. And basically, if you look on the other hand, like the providers of different and operators of sensor networks, they already offer some sort of cloud where they offer their sensor data. So it means that what we talk about here is something which is between the private sector and the public sector, and gives the chance to provide a unified view on the data across the city. View these slides, be available for the partners, yes. MDesk, okay, clear, thanks. Okay, very nice. So if you have any other questions, feel free to ask them exactly with it right now. Okay. Okay, so then we move to the next slide. Okay, probably before we move to the next slide, let me just give you an update on what are our current activities besides the Triangulum project. So if you look at this big picture, we contributed many of these aspects to the Memorandum of Understanding standardization activity of the EU. However, there is you won't find it exactly in this form there, because this is already a very large consortium with many big players. But we were very present with our ideas there, and I think that we managed to influence the discussion there very nicely. And so there you would basically find something of a similar type. Yeah, probably the layers are called differently, and instead of SIPs they have something called capabilities, etc. But the principles that you see here are very similar to the principles in this Memorandum of Understanding, Smart Cities and Communities discussions which are going on for the last 2 years. So basically now there is a discussion on interfaces between the layers that they have defined, and we are also contributing there with our insights from the Triangulum project. Besides, there is another initiative which is currently going on in Germany. It is the DIN standardization on open urban platforms, where we are also contributing with use cases and also quite a lot of aspects on the interfaces. So it means that once you manage to grasp the ideas which are presented here, this is pretty much similar to what is going on right now in the standardization activities across Europe. Okay, now I'm trying to move on to the next slide and somehow I'm having problems. Okay, now it worked. Okay, so basically around such an architecture you would need some sort of governance model, and you can already see that there is some sort of description exactly on this picture in the D61 deliverable. Just a small note, so the D61 deliverable is basically the core information on this ICT reference architecture. It is being updated over the course of the project, based also on feedback from the involved cities. But we also have some, I would say we have some scientific publications on that topic which are coming around. So we already have 2 or 3 papers accepted which are coming out this year. So this is also a way to disseminate this architecture. And by the time they are published and are out on the web, we can also notify you on that later on. So it means, so coming back to the picture on this slide, so within the D61 deliverable, you would also see an explanation to this figure, but in general you see that the ICT reference architecture would support, and on the other hand would benefit from a particular smart city governance model. So in general you would have some objectives, and then from these objectives and strategy you're going to derive some sort of smart city principles. And you would probably have, for some of the principles, you would have some leadership defined and a dedicated organization, which is going to take care of this leadership, and which would come up with some policies and regulations with respect to the ICT approach within the city. Then within these policies and regulations, you would of course need to enable the collaboration of the different stakeholders. Of course, everywhere we have the various aspects of the ICT reference architecture underneath, and having the stakeholder collaborate, you would probably define some processes which are also enabled by the ICT reference architecture. Finally, you're going to measure the performance, which is also going to be a performance measurement on the aspects enabled by the ICT reference architecture itself, and you're going to close the circle by checking your objective and strategy if it was achieved. And you can imagine that around all these aspects, the ICT reference architecture plays a crucial role. On one hand, it enables this circle to be closed, but on the other hand, it is also an asset within this circle. So it means it is something which also needs to be measured and also somehow shaped in the way of the smart city governance model. Okay, now it becomes very interesting, at least from the technical point of view. So basically, we are going now to have a look at the services or at the service access points between the layers of the ICT reference architecture. So basically, on the slide before, you saw that we had this data sources layer, the communication layer, the data analysis and processing layer or whatever. And we had, it is practically, when you see an ICT solution within a city, it is somehow easy to map different parts of this solution to some of these layers. But what becomes very interesting is to see how different components and modules communicate across these layers. For that reason, you need a sort of an abstract model, as I already said, which explains and gives you a notion of this communication across layers. In that sense, we had a look at the ISO-OSI model, which is basically the main model that enabled the rapid advance of telecommunication services across the world in the past decades. And there, the people have thought of something called service access point, which is a very abstract description of the communication capabilities between two layers. So it means what we came up within Triangulum, we are by far not ready. We still want to improve these concepts. But what we came up with is, just a second, my computer is doing some strange stuff. Okay, now I'm back. So what we came up with is a set of such service access points with a particular description, and these service access points is what we're going to have a look at on the next slides. So our basic idea is that we have two layers. Let's think of it like this. We have the, for example, let's think of the data sources layer and the communication layer, and on the other side we have some components in the data analysis layer which have to communicate across this set of layers. And basically the idea is to use so-called service primitives, where we have some service users on one hand, and these are the components on the one side of the layer structure, and on the other side we have other service users, and in the middle there is something called a service provider, and this would be basically the machinery of a particular layer. What is like the very basic notion and model that you can go for there is you send a request from the one side, there is indication that something is requested. On the other side, there is a sort of response, and on the side where we started at the beginning, there is a confirmation about this. So around this very primitive and simple model, we would like to create the notion of a service access point. So let's now go back to this view that we had like several slides ago. So now you see that exactly based on this these very simple considerations, we can already think of different service access points which we can place between the different layers of the architecture. You can already see them there. We have something called a DAD SAP, which I'll be very honest, right now I don't know what it stands for, but we can have a look in the document, and there is a very particular description of what happens around this DAD SAP, and there is something also. Okay, thank you. I just got a reminder of the time restriction. So we are moving forward here, but I think the concept is pretty clear. So we have something like an interface between the layers. Okay. Now, so you can see, for example, just a second. So now you can see, for example, this is a sort of like an explanation across the layers of the ICT reference architecture of the BMS management solution it's in Manchester, yeah, Robert? Is it Manchester? Yeah. Yeah. So what you can see here, okay, so you can see here is how a particular solution, which is already rolled out in one of the lighthouse cities of the Triangulum project, can be mapped to the layers of the ICT reference architecture. So you see that you have some device controllers and device sensors which clearly belong to the data sources, and you see that we have some communication technology, and that somewhere we have a data analysis layer on top of it. So what is also, just a second. Okay, so if we move, just a second. Okay, so if we move on, you can see that we also can, just a second. Now, so you can see that on top of it there is also like some additional services which correspondingly belong to the communication, to the data analysis layer. So this is, for example, is the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. You can also easily decompose the solution as a whole, identify different components, and you can already map them to the different layers of the ICT reference architecture. So for example, if we look at a particular big data analytics solution, you can also see that on the left-hand side, we have something like public transport data, smart metering data, data flowing over the communication layer to a particular metadata storage engine. We have some university data center which stores this data, and then we also have like different technology which fits inside this university data center there. Okay, so what are basically our next steps here? So we want to continue the refinement and definition of the SAPs. We work quite intensively on the security aspects, and we also contribute to different standardization activities within that I already mentioned before. What is our goal at the end of the project is, of course, to enable the replication of solutions across cities. So you see that we have already laid down the basic concepts, but we would very likely want to show you later on how you can basically take some part of the data sources from one city, combine it with some part of the data analysis and processing layer from another city, and also put something on top coming from the applications and users layers from a third city, and create a new solution for a city that needs something particular. Okay, so this is like more or less the current status of our works. Things are continuing, so applications, etc. So it means that all these concepts will be refined many times, and currently we're just about to finalize the status of explaining what is out there in many of the cities, but in the next step we would like to put some added value on top of the architecture by enabling exactly this interoperability and this combination of solutions across the cities. So this is like the presentation itself as it was prepared by Philip, which I'm very thankful for. So if you have any questions, I would be very glad to answer them either now or later on in the 1-hour discussion slot. Thank you so much. I see there is one question. Just a second. The answer is very simple, yes. So the question is whether we are going to provide any any support to achieve conformance of the present technology to the ICT reference architecture? Yes. The answer is yes, and we are also going to adapt the architecture in order to explain the reality. So we don't expect people to change things on the ground, but we are mostly seeking for a model that explains everything which is.
Can you see that?
Yes, I can see your presentation. I hope everyone else too.
So, quick introduction. So, my name is Michael King. I'm with an SME in Manchester called Clicks and Links. So we're obviously in the Manchester work package, like Lighthouse City. We're in the ICT work stream, reporting into the University of Manchester, lead the work stream for Manchester. So we've only got about 6 or 7 slides, and I'll try to sort of tab backwards and forwards on my screen just to the chat. So if anyone wants me to slow down or to sort of go over points, just say in the chat, but I'll look at the slides. I think I'm only sharing my presentation, so hopefully you don't see the tabbing, you just see the slides. But yeah, if you want me to stop on any points or anything, just say. Like I say, about 6 slides. Some of the slides have got deliberately too much information for a presentation because we understand they're going to be shared afterwards, so hopefully there's more useful information that can be read rather than me reading out all of the detail. Yeah, I think that's it really. So the title we were given, we didn't choose this, so hopefully it's relevant to this, is a service layer to make data not just available but usable. And what we wanted to share is this basically a concept that has been around in Manchester for about 5 or 6 years, and it's called Manchester Eye. So the Eye is a reference to iPhone, iPad, basically anything digital, effectively. And 5 or 6 years ago, before the Triangulum project, it was a concept put into another large lighthouse city, but a UK sort of schema that Manchester wasn't successful in that case, but the idea was sort of still carried on and so fed into Triangulum. And we've looked to sort of flesh it out more and are looking to do some early steps on the road to this concept. But this overall thing of Manchester Eye is a concept. So the title for this is The Concept of Manchester Eye, Collaborative Curation of a City's Digital Assets as a Defining Feature of a Smart City. So slide 1, I'm just tabbing, there's no question. So slide 1, normally we do this as a build slide with each of the bits coming in, but obviously just to keep things simple on this webinar format, it's not done like that. But if I can try and talk to it, the way we characterize a problem that all cities, we believe, face. If you just look at the top and the bottom groups in this, we think, right, basically there's a lot of data in cities. So some of that data is in big aggregations, you know, so someone like Transport for Greater Manchester, the Transport Authority for buses and trams and local rail and so on, all of the roads, they have loads of data of various sources, from traffic through to air quality and loads of other things. But then increasingly what we see in an IoT world is there's loads of small data sources.
Michael, I'm not sure if the slides moved on. I don't know. I'm not seeing it moved on. Anybody else?
Finn, I'm looking at the next slide. But...
Is anybody else? Hello?
Okay, yeah, somebody else is saying it. Yeah, let me. I've definitely got the second slide on my screen.
Oh, it's okay.
But that's not in presentation mode. Can you see it now?
Now, yeah, now. Yeah.
But not in slideshow. Okay, is that big enough to see?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if slide, I was in presentation mode. Maybe that doesn't work. So this, thanks Finn for that interruption. So this slide normally we do as a build, and So if you picture, there's loads of data sources, which is what we're showing at the bottom here. And again, there's some of them are big data sources, and some of them are, you know, individuals, frankly. So citizen science projects and anything. So there's this vast array of data sources spread across the city. All of it's useful. Some of it is what might be called open data in a very strict way. Some of it might be commercial and not open data, but still useful for a city. And then at the top, there are numerous potential users, whether they're people, groups, or organizations, and uses of how that data might benefit the city. And so we characterize this as a sort of many-to-many problem of how do users and find the data that they want. And you know, how does that go on? So effectively Manchester Eye is trying to be this bridge in the middle and trying to fill this gap of improving this flow of useful data to people and in groups that can use it for the benefit of the city. So it's sort of an integrating service, we're thinking of it. And there's a slide shortly, I think, where we've struggled with many sort of metaphors as to what we mean by this. But one of the early ones that we've kept with is the idea of an Airbnb for data. So if you think Airbnb doesn't own the properties, but obviously they've sort of got this network of properties and that other people use, and it sort of arguably helped to grow that sort of market without going into the strengths and weaknesses of that in a general sense. Let me just tab, no questions, thanks. Everyone can see this. So yeah, so that's, and we have this, if you remember there's a film, you know, there can be only one. We had this idea of there can be only one Manchester Eye. So that was what that was about. So what is Manchester Eye? So again, this is an evolving view, and again, we'd definitely like to share this in the spirit of sharing, and please, you know, other ideas more than welcome, really. So let's do some what it definitely isn't first. It definitely isn't a single big data warehouse. This is not saying there should be one single data warehouse in which every piece of data is aggregated and collected. It's not at this level, conceptual level, arguing for specific technologies. So you may have heard of things like CCAN, which is an open source, pretty much de facto cataloging system, which, you know, would make sense to be part of an architecture to support Manchester Eye, but we're not looking to get into that level at this stage. It isn't a set of standards, so there's various standards around there about how to even get into the ontology of a city, of how you define data and all different schemas and so on. So what it is a concept that recognizes the importance of data. It probably is a catalogue, and I'll come on expand on this a bit, but a catalogue as a concept works, and importantly there's an ongoing nature to this, where we're calling this a curation process. So there's an active part of management of this. Rather than just get the data, there is an ongoing librarian sort of curation process. Some of the metaphors, just quickly to give you, that we've gone through over the times, and Amazon, as in the retailer for data, you know, trying to be a single port for everything with suppliers from anywhere. A data loom, which is a sort of like a weaving mechanism. A tool hire, so again, you don't own the tools, but you have access to them. You can see the ideas anyway. And then the last one, Airbnb, I think we'll expand a bit on next. Let me just tab. No questions, I'll keep on. So here's a draft vision. Again, I won't read all of this. Hopefully this will be useful for people to read afterwards. But so it's like an Airbnb for city data. It's the process is Triangulum is on technical SMEs